Good afternoon and welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists January webinar. My name is Ariana Sutton-Greer and I'm going to be your moderator today. The general format for today's webinar will be about a 45-minute presentation by our speaker, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions at the end. We're going to start actually today with just a few announcements, but before we get to the announcements, I want to make sure everybody is familiar with just how the GoToWebinar system works. So on the right side of your screen, there is a control panel that looks like the example you're seeing on this slide. In the audio pane, you can adjust the webinar audio by using your telephone or computer speakers. At any time during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane, and our presenter will be answering the questions again at the end of the presentation. I'll keep track of those questions as they come in. If you would like a copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handouts pane of the control panel. And we are proud to announce that this webinar has been pre-approved by the Society's professional certification program and is applicable for 0.06 continuing education credits that can be applied to your professional wetland scientist certification application or renewal. As a reminder, participation certificates are available upon request also. So please contact SWS staff if interested. Certificates are also available for those who watch webinar recordings. All webinars are recorded and archived for complimentary viewing by members on our past webinars page. We also ask that you take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. In addition, we encourage you to use the hashtag SWSwebinar on Twitter to tweet about today's webinar. Okay, let's test the questions pane really quickly. And I'll get some demographics information at the same time. Can I have folks type in the state or country that you are participating from today? All right, I'm seeing Florida, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Arkansas. Sounds great. North Dakota, New Jersey, Nova Scotia. All right, we're going international. That's great. Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. So before we get going on the webinar, I have two announcements that were important enough. I didn't want to wait and do them at the end. I didn't want to lose anybody. So first of all, our next webinar, our next webinar is February 15th, and it's called The Enigmatic Okavango Delta, a large wetland in a dry land by Dr. Fred Ellery. So please join us for that. That will be at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we hope to see you there. And just so you all know, we're always looking for future webinar presenters and topics. So if you're interested in presenting, or if you have someone you would suggest to give an SWS webinar, then please indicate this in the evaluation survey that you do at the very end today after the webinar, or feel free to contact SWS headquarters with that suggestion. Second announcement is that we are very excited about this year's SWS annual meeting in Denver, Colorado. It will be May 29th through June 1st, and the registration for that meeting is officially open. So please, I hope many of you can join us at that conference, and reminder that abstracts are due January 22nd. There was an extension on the abstract deadline, so get yours in by next Monday. And then award nominations and student research grant applications are due January 31st. So now that we have those announcements out of the way, I want to introduce our presenter today, who is a friend and colleague of mine, Stephanie Simpson. Stephanie is the Blue Carbon Program Senior Manager for Restore America's Estuaries, or RAE, where she works to build regional and national capacity for utilizing blue carbon ecosystem services to increase investment in coastal restoration and conservation. In this role, Stephanie develops outreach products, leads the U.S. Blue Carbon National Working Group, and works with partners to develop tools and pilot projects utilizing blue carbon to support estuary restoration. Prior to coming to RAE, Stephanie was an ORISE Fellow for the EPA's Office of Water. She worked at the ACE Basin National Estuarine Research Reserve in South Carolina, and she served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Philippines, promoting environmental stewardship and working with locals on coastal resource management. Stephanie has her BS in biology from Clemson University and an MS in environmental studies from the College of Charleston. Welcome, Stephanie. I'm thrilled to have you with us today, and I will turn things over to you.
All right, thanks so much, Ariana. I'm just going to take back control and advance the slides. There we go. So again, thank you for having me speak on today's webinar. I'm talking about blue carbon, science and application for adding value to estuary restoration. First, I'd like to give a quick background or introduction to Restore America's Estuaries for those who may not be familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit dedicated to the protection and restoration of our nation's bays and estuaries as essential natural resources. And we do this through an alliance of 10 conservation organizations that we lead across the U.S. coast, as well as through our national programs, including Blue Carbon, Living Shorelines, and National Estuaries Week. We also hold a biannual summit, so I'd like to do an additional plug as you're making your plans this year for SWS meeting this summer, that you also consider attending the National Summit for Coastal and Estuarine Restoration and Management this December in Long Beach, California. It's the largest gathering of the coastal management and restoration community, and our call for proposals has just been released. So I would encourage you to check out more information about our summit and call for proposals online if you're interested. And with that quick plug, I'll go back to our topic at hand of blue carbon. So we all know that estuaries and coastal wetlands are these amazing places that provide tremendous benefits and services. And blue carbon is one of the last ecosystem services really to be recognized in the context of climate change and coastal resiliency. And so our goal has been and is to explore ways to utilize blue carbon to achieve more of our coastal restoration and protection goals without losing sight of all of these other ecosystem services. So to make sure we're all on the same page, when I say blue carbon, I'm talking about coastal blue carbon, the greenhouse gases stored in, sequestered by, and released from coastal marine ecosystems, including seagrass, mangroves, salt marshes, and other tidal wetlands. And our goal in recognizing this ecosystem service is to provide additional opportunity to add value to our efforts, enhance management, and increase public and private investment in coastal habitat restoration and conservation. So at RAY, we're exploring several different ways to do this. We are piloting access for tidal wetland activities into the carbon market. We're supporting science by leading and supporting assessments to determine how much carbon is stored in these systems. We work with our federal and state partners to explore policy and regulatory options that could help drive increased protection and restoration of wetlands. And we coordinate activities both regionally and nationally, working to raise awareness and build capacity through webinars, workshops, and resource development. So for today's webinar, I'm going to cover some of the basic science concepts to understand. I'm going to share some results from some of the blue carbon assessments that Ray has led. And then I'm also going to go into how the carbon market works and what the opportunity is for tidal wetlands before wrapping up with some next steps. First, when we're talking about the greenhouse gases within tidal wetlands, and apologies if this is review for many of you, but we're referring to these big three here. So carbon dioxide sequestered or captured by plants and stored in the plant material and in the soil, nitrous oxide, which is mainly related to anthropogenic causes where agriculture is used on or near wetlands, and methane. And methane is of particular interest because, like nitrous oxide, it's a more potent greenhouse gas. So a reduction in methane emissions could lead to a huge climate benefit. Methane can be challenging in that it can be highly variable in wetland systems. However, recent studies of the past year has shown a relationship between salinity and methane. So this research shows that at salinities below 18 parts per thousand, methane can be quite variable. But once you get to that about 18 to 20 parts per thousand and higher, methane can be quite negligible. This is due to the sulfates in salt water outcompeting methanogens at these higher levels. And this is important for wetland restoration in areas where a road or a dike may have limited tidal flow into a wetland, causing it to become fresh and emit methane. In those cases, if you could restore tidal flow and therefore salinity, there's a big potential for methane emission reductions. And I'll get into this more later. So when we think about carbon storage in wetlands, consider that this is due to the buildup of organic matter, the same principle that allows healthy wetlands to accrete over time. So as these systems are consistently inundated, the soil is very anoxic and decomposition is low, allowing that dead plant material and accumulated sediment to build up over time. This should allow wetlands to keep pace with sea level rise, but increases in sea level rise rates over the past few years due to climate change along with human impacts to natural sediment supply, has altered this balance. But in many cases, the soil depth in wetland systems can be several meters deep. And that means decades or even centuries of carbon can be stored under these systems, further highlighting the need to protect habitats, not just for the overall habitat protection and other ecosystem services, but also to protect the large carbon stores that these habitats sit on top of. And we can see this depicted here. This graph shows how much carbon can be stored in these systems. When we look at a comparison of carbon stocks, you'll see that coastal habitats store the majority of carbon in their soil, where it can remain locked up for centuries or more. So although these systems only take up about 2% of the area that terrestrial forests do, they're storing significant amounts of carbon on a smaller per area basis. Also note that this graph only shows carbon stored in the first meter of soil, and as I mentioned, many wetland habitats have soil depths that can go several meters deep, leading to larger estimates of stored carbon. And the other thing is the ability of these habitats, these ecosystems, to sequester at much more efficient rates than their terrestrial counterparts on a per acre basis. This graph is a great comparison, noting that it uses a logarithmic scale. It shows that wetland habitats can accumulate soil carbon up to 10 times more per hectare than forests. And I'm not doing this to negate the role that forests have, but rather to show that forest conservation efforts, we know they've gained a lot of ground for their abilities to sequester carbon, and we want to see our coastal wetlands valued similarly. In addition to all the great ecosystem services they have, that they're also important carbon sinks. And yet we all know the habitat loss that these systems face. Globally, coastal wetlands are being lost at unsustainable rates of up to 7% per year. And when these systems are drained and degraded, that stored carbon can oxidize back into the atmosphere, leading to a rapid release of what could be hundreds of years of carbon back into the atmosphere in a matter of decades or less. Each year, it's estimated that an average 500 million tons of CO2 are released due to wetland degradation. And to put that amount in perspective, it's roughly equivalent to the emissions of an entire country like the United Kingdom or Japan. And according to the 2013 Status and Trends of Wetlands report produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA, an estimated 80,000 acres are being lost on an annual basis in the U.S. So this again highlights the need to protect our remaining coastal wetlands and also look for new and innovative ways to bring more resources for restoration and conservation efforts. So this brings us back to why we're interested in blue carbon. We're working to use blue carbon as an additional driver, along with all the other important ecosystem services they provide, to help further prioritize wetland conservation and restoration efforts and try to bring new partners to the table. Over the past few years, the science on blue carbon has increased with new publications coming out seemingly every few months. And this has been really great for the blue carbon community, blue carbon work. There's been rapid increase in field work in both terms of techniques and data, including remote sensing and modeling. But we still need baseline data in degraded conditions, more models, proxies, and simpler, more cost-effective methods for collecting data. And I'll get into more of some of this remaining data needs a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to briefly cover a few studies that have furthered our understanding of blue carbon and how we think about this ecosystem service in the context of restoration and management. So in 2014, Ray and our partners set out to answer this question of what is the blue carbon benefit of estuary restoration? So we led a study in the Snohomish Estuary of Puget Sound, Washington. It's made up, the area is made up of mainly forested, scrub, shrub, and emergent tidal wetlands that have experienced a lot of clearing and draining over the past 100 years, mostly due to agricultural use. And one of the reasons we chose this estuary in particular to look at is due to its relative resilience to sea level rise. So the study included collecting soil carbon cores at natural, drained, and restored sites to determine both carbon stock and accumulation rates. And what we found was that current and future restoration plans, which would restore about 3,300 acres, would result in 2.5 million tons of carbon dioxide captured over the next 100 years, which is an equivalent amount to taking 500,000 cars off the road for a year. And if the entire Snohomish Estuary were to be restored, that could result in almost 9 million tons of CO2 sequestered, which would be like taking 1.7 million cars off the road for a year. So these results demonstrate that there is a clear climate benefit to restoring our coastal wetlands. So next we took the same study approach to Tampa Bay, a highly urbanized setting where sea level rise is of major concern. And this study included taking measurements of carbon in seagrass, marsh, and mangrove habitats in the region, but it also looked at how these habitats are projected to change with local sea level rise projections. And what we found was that the current habitat will continue to sequester 3.5 million tons of carbon over the next 100 years, which is equivalent to taking 160,000 cars off the road every year until 2100. Restoration projects have removed over 200,000 tons of carbon dioxide since 2006, and that doesn't include existing habitats in Tampa Bay. That's just the restored ones. As far as sea level rise, it's predicted to change habitat distribution in the region with a likely decrease in intertidal habitats. But interestingly, in many areas where marshes may drown, seagrasses are likely to expand into these areas. And this could have a big role in sustaining some of the ecosystem services these habitats provide, including carbon sequestration and storage. Of course, this would also depend on the region maintaining water quality to allow seagrass meadows to expand, but this is something that Tampa has seen success in over the past few years. And now Tampa Bay habitat managers are looking at ways to use this information in their management plans to encourage things like upland conservation, prioritizing vulnerable areas for restoration, and again, maintaining water quality in the region. And the last study I want to mention is the Bringing Wetlands to Market project, which is now in its second phase. It began in 2011. It's being led by the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve and funded by the National Estuarine Research Reserve Science Collaborative. As part of this project, they're quantifying greenhouse gas emissions and carbon sequestration in salt marshes to better understand the processes in these and to develop a model to make predictions based on more easily accessible data points. This work has also supported the development of market tools under Ray's lead. So although the project is still ongoing, I want to share some of the results thus far. So a model has been developed to estimate CO2 and methane fluxes using more accessible data points like light, soil temperature, salinity, and water depth. The model is available online if you'd like to check that out, and it's being further validated in salt marshes across the region. And as I mentioned, this work has helped Ray and our partners to develop some market tools, including a restoration methodology. And we're also working to pilot this market initiative at the Herring River Restoration Site, but I will talk about that in a few more slides. So next, I'm going to transition into carbon finance opportunities for wetlands, as this is an area we're exploring to apply blue carbon, and it's also a new topic area for most folks. So our motives are twofold in this endeavor. We want to achieve real reductions in greenhouse gases through projects that also support habitat, water quality, and other ecosystem services. And we also want to tap into additional funding to support conservation and restoration efforts, like the success that's being seen by RED, or reforestation projects. It is important to note that if you, as a project developer, are considering making your project a carbon offset project, that the carbon finance component should inform the project from the start. It's not something that can just be added on last minute for reasons that will become very apparent. But first, a little bit of background on how the carbon market works. Carbon offsets are generated from projects that prevent emissions and or remove atmospheric greenhouse gases. And there are many different types of project categories for doing this. For example, a wind farm, it could be methane reduction, or a reforestation project. So a company, government, or individual who wishes to reduce their carbon emissions may choose to do so through many means. First, we would encourage them to make internal changes so they could reduce their overall emissions. But for those emissions which cannot be avoided, they may choose to purchase offsets. So in this example, company A needs to meet its emission reduction goals. So they invest in an emission reduction project like reforestation or restoration, and in turn receive the carbon offsets generated from that project. So this is a way for them to simultaneously reduce their emissions while also investing in sustainable projects. It's a win-win for everyone. Now, carbon offsets are measured in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, with one carbon offset equal to 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So if you imagine a project that would generate methane emissions, that would generate a lot of CO2 equivalents and therefore a lot of offsets. As far as market opportunities in the US, as we know, there is not a national compliance market. There are regional ones like in California and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the New England states. But for most folks, the primary market for offsets is the voluntary carbon market, and this is a global market. And in this market, integrity is key. Buyers want to know that the offsets they're buying are real reductions in greenhouse gases. And this is where standards come in. Standards ensure transparency and integrity of offsets being produced by providing the general requirements for projects, including validation and verification procedures. So what this means is that they ensure methodologies follow sound science and that accounting of greenhouse gas reductions are accurate and transparent. There are a number of standards out there. A few that you can be familiar with are the Verified Carbon Standard, American Carbon Registry, and Climate Action Reserve, though there are others. We have been working with the Verified Carbon Standard, or VCS, to include wetlands as an offset category for offsets. And we chose to work with them because they are the highest issuer offsets, particularly land use offsets, and have high credibility in the market. You can see in this graph the darker blues on the right-hand side are offsets issued by VCS. So they do control a fair amount of the market. And to give you an idea of how much money is generated for projects in this market, in 2015, the voluntary carbon market saw 84 million tons of offsets sold, with a market value of $278 million. So a significant amount that we'd like to see coastal wetlands be able to get a piece of. So in order for a project to get to market, you must follow an approved methodology. Again, this is the step-by-step requirements for quantifying the greenhouse gas benefits for a particular project activity. So standards like VCS have a rigorous approval process for methodologies. And so a project developer would need to follow a standard approved methodology for their specific project activity that details the monitoring, reporting, and verification procedures and requirements. So I wanted to share some insight into who is buying offsets and why. So purchasers represent a variety of sectors, but we see a lot of offsets being sold to those in the events and entertainment sector, in the service industry, and in energy and transportation. If you think about big events like the Super Bowl and the Olympics, they're now trying to be carbon neutral. And sectors like oil and gas and airlines tend to have a lot of interest in offsets as part of their internal greenhouse gas reduction and sustainability goals. This is also reflected when we look at why purchasers buy offsets. The main reasons cited included demonstrating climate leadership and in pursuit of greenhouse gas targets. As for the types of offsets being sold, the top three are renewables, forestry, and land use, excuse me, and methane reduction projects. This graph shows offsets transacted in 2015 by project category, where light blue is renewables and dark blue is forestry and land use. Forestry projects such as RED+, and again, that's reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, just this year was outpaced by renewables. But they still make up for a large percentage of the preferred offsets by purchasers. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a head cold, so I might need a few moments. So in addition to renewables, land use offsets are a preferred category, and buyers show preference for these offsets for a couple of different factors, including understandability, which is why renewables sell so well, and co-benefits, which is why land use projects sell so well. So buyers in the US also tend to favor projects near their home base as a way to invest in projects that benefit their local community in addition to the global climate benefit. And these are the reasons why we think coastal wetland projects would do well in this market. So across standards, here are the kind of general project requirements that a project has to meet in order to generate carbon offsets. First, it must be real, so you have to demonstrate that the reductions have actually occurred. They must be additional. This means that the project goes beyond business as usual. And when it comes down to it, really this means that the compensatory or mitigated projects are not eligible to earn carbon offsets on the voluntary carbon market. Now the reason for this is that we don't want to provide offsets for projects that would have happened anyways, because then we aren't making gains in greenhouse gas reductions. So standards like the VCS provide project developers with a tool to demonstrate additionality. The next is permanence. So project developers should do a risk analysis and mitigate risks of reversals. An example of this is if a storm comes through and tears up new plantings. And standards require you to have a buffer pool of offsets, and those act as an insurance that if any offsets that are already sold happen to be reversed, that those are still real, excuse me, because of the buffer pool. This is especially important in coastal zones and means additional factors must be considered in project planning, such as land use change over time and sea level rise. The next is verified. So as part of the approval process, project documentation of methods for accounting must undergo an independent third-party validation. Not harmful, so hopefully this is obvious. We want to make sure project activities are not causing any negative impacts inside or adjacent to the project area. Practical, again, hopefully this is obvious. We want to minimize project implementation barriers. And ownership. So who owns the offsets generated from a project must be clearly laid out in project documentation, as this may not always be the landowner. So all the standards generally follow a consistent set of principles that work together to come as close to a guarantee that any offsets issued are legitimate and a real reduction in net greenhouse gas emissions. So the different activities for tidal wetlands that could lead to a greenhouse gas reduction and therefore generate carbon offsets include restoring and creating wetlands. So this would be increasing sequestration and or reducing emissions from drained or degraded wetlands. Activities could include enhancing, creating, or managing hydrological conditions, sediment supply, salinity characteristics, water quality, or also planting native plant communities. And then also the conservation of intact wetlands, so thereby protecting those existing carbon stocks from depleting. In order to generate credits, a project must result in a net project benefit, which means that the project must account for a baseline, so without the project scenario, and a with project scenario of emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And a project needs to have that net benefit in order to claim carbon credits. This is achieved by having lower emissions in the with project scenario compared to the baseline scenario. And this can be achieved through many different ways. You may start with high emissions in your baseline, but with your project scenario, you could still have emissions, but as long as you have achieved a reduction in those emissions, you could still then earn credits for the amount of emission reductions compared to the baseline. Some specific project activities to consider that could generate carbon offsets include protecting existing stocks, as I mentioned before, and reconnection of impounded wetlands, so reducing methane emissions in those instances, and rewetting of drained wetlands, so that would stop the ongoing emissions of carbon loss, and then finally restoration. But I would caution that restoration should probably be more of a complementary activity with one of the above. So as an overview of the process, you would need a standard approved methodology for your project activity. Then the first step would be to conduct a feasibility study to determine if your project is appropriate for a carbon offset project. Next, you need to develop a project design document that shows how your project will follow protocols laid out in the methodology. And once that's been through validation, you can begin earning carbon credits. So there are a number of wetland methodologies that have been developed and approved by standards over the last few years. They include a coastal wetland creation methodology approved by the Verified Carbon Standard and developed by the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. There's a restoration of degraded wetlands of the Mississippi Delta approved by American Carbon Registry, developed by TR Resources, and the Global Tidal Wetland and Seagrass Restoration Methodology approved by the Verified Carbon Standard and developed by Ray and our partners. We also have a conservation methodology that's been developed and is currently in the approval process by VCS and hopefully will be finally approved in the next month or two. I do want to highlight the Global Tidal Wetland and Seagrass Restoration Methodology as it is globally applicable and covers a wide range of eligible restoration activities. One thing I want to note about this methodology is it has a standardized approach to additionality for US-based projects. Basically, this means that because restoration is happening at a low pace in the US, Any project, as long as it's not part of a mitigated or compensatory project, is considered additional. So projects outside the US can be additional, but project developers will need to demonstrate the additionality using the tool provided by VCS. But again, this methodology includes a wide range of eligible activities and all tidal wetland and seagrass habitats globally. And this is, the restoration methodology includes many options for greenhouse gas accounting, including the use of published data, default values, and emission factors, as well as field collected data and validated models and proxies. And recognizing that this is a new and evolving field where the science is insufficient, project developers have the flexibility to demonstrate data choices using expert judgment. For example, data sets or literature of similar areas to the project. So in addition to the methodology, Ray also developed a project guidebook to aid project developers in developing a blue carbon offset project. The guidebook is meant to accompany the methodology, orienting project developers to how the carbon market works and walking through the steps to use the methodology. An additional resource is the Coastal Blue Carbon Field Manual, which was developed by Conservation International and IUCN and lays out how to go about getting that blue carbon data. And all of these resources can be found on our website. So the market opportunity for tidal wetlands is still very new. So we're looking for opportunities to pilot these concepts. Here are a couple of pilot projects we're involved with. The first I mentioned before, as associated with the Bringing Wetlands to Market project, is the Herring River Restoration Project in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This is the largest tidal wetland restoration project in New England and involves about 1,000 acres of wetland that was historically tidal until, as you'll see in this picture, the road was built across it with a very small culvert that limits tidal flow. And it's resulted in this impounded wetland that's become fresh and thus is emitting methane. So the restoration project involves replacing the road with a bridge that includes tide gates to allow tidal flow back into the wetland. And once that tidal flow is restored, the salinity will increase, halting emissions of methane and resulting in significant climate benefits. So we've been working with the Cape Cod National Seashore, Wacoit Bay Reserve, NOAA, USGS, and others to further explore this opportunity as a carbon project. And another pilot project I'll mention is one in collaboration with the Rookery Bay Reserve in Southwest Florida. And this project involves about 300 acres of mangrove habitat that is experiencing die-off. The project will improve hydrologic conditions, preventing future die-off and encourage restoration of degraded areas, resulting in CO2 emission reductions and sequestration. So we're exploring how we can use blue carbon as added value for this project. And these are both in the feasibility stages and are helping to improve our understanding of how to get a project to market. So these projects also help us to better identify where we need more science. And this is where I'm hoping that this audience can be of help. Our remaining science need include a number of things. I just highlighted kind of the top ones here on this slide. They include emissions and degraded wetlands. So folks love to go out and collect data from nice natural and restored wetlands, but not so much from the degraded wetlands. Can't imagine why, but that's where we need data from. We also need regionally relevant baseline data of both CO2 and methane fluxes, especially for highly heterogeneous systems. This can improve inventories and model development. We need a better understanding of the fate of carbon following submergence and erosion and how that relates to geomorphic conditions and to different sources of disturbance. Development of models and proxies for all three greenhouse gases. This is really important to help reduce labor and cost of monitoring, particularly important for developing baseline scenarios and conducting monitoring for both inventories and market projects. A better understanding of how much we're restoring annually in the US and how this relates to national emission factors. And I also want to highlight the importance of having peer-reviewed papers available at various regions and habitat types for both market and inventory efforts. So if anyone has interest or is currently exploring any of these topics, I would love to know about it. And as more and more research grants require connections to end users and applied science, I would encourage you to reach out to me as either Restore America's Estuaries could act in this role, or we could connect you with partners in your region who are looking for this type of data. And I'll have my contact information at the end. So as our next steps, we'd like to be able to pilot this market approach in various restoration scenarios and habitats. We're looking for opportunities to expand the science, address remaining science needs, as previously mentioned, and also to develop tools for stakeholders to estimate and communicate blue carbon value. We're working to include blue carbon within the full suite of ecosystem services and outreach and management strategies, and agencies like NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service have been key partners for us in this endeavor. Nationally, I also want to note we've made some great progress in recognizing blue carbon. Following guidance from the 2013 IPCC Wetland Supplement, which encouraged nations to use and report back on assessing carbon stocks changes in tidal wetlands, Ray partnered with NOAA, EPA, and our lead PI, Dr. Steve Crooks, to put together a coastal wetland carbon working group to go about the task of incorporating coastal wetlands into the U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And last year, the U.S. became one of the first countries to do so. And you can see the inclusion of coastal wetlands in the 2015 inventory online. So I want to underline the importance of this inventory work in stimulating interest in understanding the carbon dynamics of these ecosystems and recognizing the ability of wetlands to capture and store greenhouse gases within annual national inventories can help to empower countries to recognize the benefits of improved wetland management. And this was also a topic of a past SWS webinar, and I believe the recording can also be found online through this link, or I think you can probably reach out to SWS staff for that as well. And finally, in addition to the market opportunity and the national inventory effort, there's a larger context for all of this work, and there are a lot of partners involved across the country working to further our understanding of this service and how we can use it to add value to the work we all do. Here's a list of a couple of these networks. First is the Blue Carbon National Working Group. This was organized in 2015 by Ray with NOAA to help advance pilot projects and database development, and we'll actually be having a second meeting of this group later this year. There's the Blue Carbon Initiative, which brings together governments, research institutions, NGOs, and communities from around the world. And this initiative is coordinated by Conservation International, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. There's also the North American Commission for Environmental Cooperation, or CEC, who coordinates activities in North America, including working with NOAA, EPA, and sister agencies in Mexico and Canada. They had formed a blue carbon working group and were working to increase mapping and data of blue carbon habitats for the continent. And most recently, a new effort has been formed to create a global blue carbon network and database. The Coastal Carbon Research Coordination Network was recently funded by NSF and is hosted at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And one of the goals of this network is to improve access to data by hosting open online literature reviews and web-based modeling tools for blue carbon. And then I will end with a little bit of a self-plug again. If you are interested in staying up to date on any of these efforts or others, I send out a monthly Blue Carbon Buzz e-newsletter to our Blue Carbon community listserv. You can sign up for it on our website, estuaries.org/bluecarbon, and I include where I can, again, updates on these different networks, new publications, other webinars, and resources as they become available. So with that, I will conclude my presentation, and I think we have some time for questions. Ariana?
Yes, thank you so much, Stephanie. That was great. Really good overview of some of the state of the science and state of the policy and markets. So that was wonderful. So folks, if you have questions for Stephanie, besides having her email address here, and you can email her later, of course, but if you have questions for Stephanie, please send them in through your chat window right now, and I will be helping to moderate and get the questions to Stephanie. And while we give you just a second to start sending in questions, I want to repeat the two quick announcements we made at the beginning. Remember that next month's seminar is February 15th at 1 p.m. Roughly same time, same place, if you're interested in that. And then the second announcement was, remember that our SWS conference is in Denver this year, May 29th through early June, and abstracts are due on January 22nd. So you still have a few days to get your abstract in. Okay, Stephanie, I'm gonna start you off with, we've got a couple questions coming in already. And so one of them is about, so with changes with this new administration federally, and a change in focus about the U.S. participation in global climate change agreements and things like that. What is your thinking on how that might affect blue carbon efforts, and just your thinking on, and how do changes in the federal administration impact, if in any way, your efforts at RAE on blue carbon or partner efforts, if you can comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a great question, one I get often. It is difficult to answer because I think there's still a lot we don't know about how this is going to play out with the new administration, even a year in. I am very glad that we got coastal wetlands included into the national inventory last year. It's in there; it's there to stay, and just having that data is a great resource that we can continue to cite and to also help drive future research and activities to monitor the role coastal wetlands have in climate mitigation. Obviously, that's not been a big priority at all for this administration, but it can still be a resource for those who are working in that field. So, I mean, I guess the main answer for that is we really just don't know how things are going to go, but we are confident in the partnerships that we've built with agencies and local and state governments that we'll be able to continue this work.
Great, thank you. And another question came in about, if there are, this question was about if we have coastal impoundments in Florida that have been created to enhance waterfowl, this objective actually may be a little bit in contradiction to the storage of blue carbon. And so when you're thinking about the benefits of a project, how do you weigh pros and cons of enhancing blue carbon storage with man-made impoundments, maybe not doing that same? How do we basically weigh these trade-offs between different wetlands that have different benefits and they may not always align with blue carbon objectives?
Sure. So, I mean, that's a great question, and I'll say that we want blue carbon to be an additional driver in support of restoration and conservation efforts. But regional or local priorities for restoration, those are going to be the primary factors that drive these projects. So if blue carbon can support those efforts, that's great, but it may not always work out that that's the case. And as we talked about, freshwater wetlands, they do tend to emit methane, but they are also capturing carbon. They may not make good carbon offset projects, but I think it's also important to note that they have these different ecosystem services, including carbon storage. And actually, Ariana, you might be able to speak more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is more complicated in freshwater systems for exactly the reasons that Stephanie outlined, in terms of when you don't have sulfate present, you do get the generation of methane, and that can offset some of your carbon storage benefits in the soil. However, the best, to the best of our knowledge, the research suggests that long-term, freshwater wetlands are also carbon sinks with a net cooling effect on climate. But in terms of short-term gains from restoring freshwater wetlands, it's a lot less clear whether you get immediate climate benefits from those systems or not. So I think your answer is perfect, in that wetlands provide so many different ecosystem services, and there are times where different benefits may not actually align so that you're getting the same benefits from the same wetland. You may need to prioritize certain wetlands specifically for species habitat, for example, and you may or may not also get an immediate carbon benefit from that kind of restoration. But long term, you likely will still get a carbon benefit. It may just be several decades in the making.
Right.
So here's another question, which kind of relates, which was that today you focused pretty much exclusively on those saltier coastal wetlands. And the question is, are you interested in carbon sequestration rates following restoration in non-tidal and non-coastal systems like bogs and fens? Where does that fit into any of your efforts?
Sure. So that hasn't been a priority topic for Restore America's Estuaries, as our focus is on coastal saline systems. But there has been work to develop methodologies for peatlands. And actually, the restoration methodology, I believe, includes peatlands within that. So there are resources available. I would check out, the Verified Carbon Standard does have some of those protocols available for other wetland areas. And I'm not sure, I can't really think of other organizations that might be focused on freshwater in particular. I don't know, Ariana, if you can think of any freshwater carbon.
Yes, particularly not specifically for like carbon offsets right now. I don't know anybody who's focused really exclusively on those systems. But again, especially as the as we start thinking about threatened systems in freshwater systems that have existed for a while, they are likely to still be providing a climate cooling impact. Even if they are producing methane, the long-term signal from those wetlands is that they are still helping to cool the planet. And so if, for example, one of those systems was threatened by development or some other kind of disturbance, it might actually be possible to get carbon credits for protecting that wetland. But at the moment, as Stephanie was saying, you have to have that whole process of having a methodology in place in order to get carbon credits. And those methodologies are not as widely available, as I understand it, for freshwater wetlands. So if that is something that that folks in the audience today would be interested in, it's certainly worth pursuing. But taking on developing a methodology is not a small undertaking. And I give Ray an enormous amount of credit for their work on the restoration methodology and then their continued work on the conservation methodology. They pulled together an incredible team of scientists and led that effort to develop both of those methodologies, which each one was a fairly Herculean effort. So don't take this on lightly is all I would say. And it's fabulous that Ray has led the way on those two protocols that then are globally applicable and are applicable in seagrasses, tidal marshes, and mangroves. So that's incredible. And so going back to another question in my list here, there's some discussion in the new administration to potentially want to increase offshore drilling. And so the question is there concern that that might actually impact blue carbon efforts if there's increased offshore drilling?
Oh, well, I would certainly say there's concern the impact that offshore drilling and particularly spills could have on our coastal wetlands just in general, their health. We've seen these impacts in places like the Gulf, where that has impacted sediment supply and water quality, in addition to the habitat that's being provided for key species. So it's definitely a concern. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I know that several state governors have expressed concern and not wanting to open up their different coastlines for offshore drilling. So it'll be interesting to see. I also think that that's something that's going to take many, many years to occur. So hopefully we won't see that really impact our coastal wetlands too much. Kind of a wait and see right now.
Yeah, great. Okay, here's another question, and this one's about mitigation banking and mitigation bankers. So are there opportunities for Ray or others in the coastal blue carbon world to work with private mitigation bankers in order to enhance tidal systems and accomplish blue carbon goals? Have you looked into that?
So we often have interest from mitigation bankers when we have these type of webinars or workshops. As far as carbon offsets, I mentioned that carbon offsets on the voluntary market, those kind of projects are not eligible to receive carbon offsets because they're mitigated. However, I do think that there is opportunity to provide that additional benefit. It's just whether or not someone is willing to pay an additional amount for quantifying that carbon benefit of a mitigation project. Something that we in the past have talked with NOAA about, and actually Ariana led a study to look at how different policies or how carbon could be included in different policies like Clean Water Act and NERDA, and found that carbon could be included in those different policies, and it could actually lead to more restoration. Say if you had to restore 2 acres of wetland and you had to restore the carbon that was lost from those 2 acres, that would be a lot more acres that would have to be restored to cover that lost carbon because of how much carbon is stored in the soils. So I think there is an opportunity to explore that. We've had some conversations at workshops, but right now we really need a lot of those remaining science gaps that I talked about to be addressed before we can. We need to build that capacity first before we can kind of pursue those other measures.
Great. So folks, I'm gonna ask a question of my own, but I want to encourage any of you who have remaining questions that you're sitting on to go ahead and send those in if you have more questions for Stephanie. So Stephanie, you've been working in this world now, the blue carbon world, for several years, and as have I. And I find it very encouraging to see some of the incredible progress really that has been made, oftentimes without a tremendous amount of budget to get there, et cetera. But what do you see as sort of some of the main limitations perhaps to kind of taking this to scale, to really just like, you know, catapulting this forward? And limitations is kind of what I was thinking about, but also, you know, is there an opportunity, like a golden opportunity that Ray is kind of working towards, that's just going to unlock the door here? What are you thinking if you had your crystal ball here for the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. So I think, you know, a couple things come to mind, really. First, you know, I mentioned before the need for validated models and proxies. To me, that's a huge thing that we need to really cut down the cost and the labor of going out and getting this carbon data. We found that carbon values can vary quite a bit across regions and habitat types. So being able to have estimates of carbon stocks and sequestration rates without having to go into the field all the time, which can be costly, that's a huge thing. So if folks are involved in and, you know, are interested in developing those type of models and proxies, that would be a huge help to this game. And as far as scalability, you know, that part is difficult because the habitat that is left to be restored in the U.S. is very fragmented. So we really need, you know, a lot of partners coming to the table. You know, I mean, restoration presents a great opportunity to collaborate and restoring multiple areas together, and then that can also achieve a greater climate benefit and generate offsets. But I guess another thing that would really help out with that is understanding what is the restoration potential in the U.S. We don't really have a good idea. We have some data from, you know, the estuary programs and the reserves about how much is being restored and what is left to be restored, but we don't have a really good, a really good source of data for that. So understanding what the restoration potential is in the U.S. would really help us identify those opportunities going forward.
Great, and I feel like both of your parts to your answer there are really perfectly targeted at this particular community of wetland scientists and wetland managers, because we might actually have the ability to help fill some of those data gaps, or to think about how do we map restoration potential, where do we know there's really amazing restoration potential. So great, perfect for this target audience. Couple more questions are coming in here. So one of them is, could voluntary estuarine restoration projects, so voluntary estuarine restoration projects, obtain additional funding from industry to help with the restoration effort? And I'm assuming that question is sort of targeted at, where does the carbon credit piece come in here? Could that really bring that additional industry funding in here? But if you have another answer about industry funding, please also provide it.
So yeah, I mean, so one of the ways that we're hoping blue carbon can help increase support for restoration efforts is not just through the carbon finance aspect. I mean, that obviously we're exploring that, but also in bringing new partners to the table. So we've had partners like, you know, gas and oil groups and fertilizer groups, and a lot of new and interesting partners come to the table who are interested in being part of the restoration projects for the blue carbon benefit. You know, I mentioned before that we see a lot of transportation and oil and gas industry with interest in this. They're setting their own internal climate mitigation goals. And what's great about coastal wetlands is that, you know, they can tout their support for these wetlands that are right here in their own backyard, you know, in the Gulf, or, you know, that are providing flood protection and water quality and habitat for key species. But they can also support those projects in an effort to help them reduce their carbon footprint. So it's exactly those type of industries that we are working to engage with blue carbon.
Great. And another question, which sort of links us from climate mitigation to climate adaptation or resilience. The question is, are you aware of cities, beach communities, and other coastal areas that are developed moving towards restoring coastal wetlands in order to protect from sea level rise and storm surges. So kind of that connection between one benefit provided by these ecosystems is the carbon sequestration, but they also provide potential risk reduction from storm surge. So is Ray involved with that too?
So yeah, so I mentioned before that in addition to blue carbon, we also run a national program on living shorelines. And I think those two intersect quite nicely in that regard as far as adaptation and resiliency. So we are working with communities and our member organizations to encourage living shorelines and to determine what the blue carbon benefit of living shorelines is. In fact, there was a study put out by Carolyn Curran, the NOAA Beaufort lab that looked at just that. And if anyone's interested in that resource, you can just let me know. And we also this year had we did a blue carbon workshop in Florida with Tampa Bay regional stakeholders, inviting those people who work in sustainability coordinators into the room, because they are thinking about municipal climate reduction goals. And so we want them to be aware that wetlands could be a factor in their planning, that wetlands provide all these different benefits, including both climate mitigation and resiliency for coastal storms and flooding. So that's something that we're exploring. It's really getting, the awareness out there, because people, again, don't really think about wetlands and climate change as much. So increasing that awareness, and then also developing tools so that folks can have an idea of what that carbon benefit is. And then also, what is the resiliency benefit? Being able to quantify that is important as well. So that's the kind of information that we need to be able to have for these different, local areas, so that when we're talking to them about the benefits of wetlands and why they should include wetlands in their sustainability goals, that we can also give them, estimates of what that benefit is.
Okay, I can't help myself, because Stephanie, you cued me up there too perfectly not to mention this, which is that there actually will be an article coming out on in the Wetlands Journal soon about wetlands and climate change, and I'm a co-author on it, which is why I know about it. But we're also turning it into a symposium that will be at the annual meeting in Denver in late May, early June. So if that topic interests you, yes, there's more coming about that. So please attend the annual meeting. With that, I'm going to say another huge thank you to Stephanie for her time and her great presentation today. And thank you all for joining in. And please send additional questions to Stephanie, and check out their amazing resources, because Ray has done a fabulous job of pulling these resources together and putting them at their website. So Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your week, and come back again for next month's webinar.
All right, thank you.